Next on stage, we have, for the second time in a row, Haggis. Last year did a very, very interesting talk. He's a game designer and writer, also a professor of creative and entertainment games at NHTV University in Breda, the Netherlands. So Mata recently released the game Fragments of Him. And so please give a warm welcome to Mata Haggis.
Hello, how are you doing? Yeah? Enjoying the show so far? That's more like it, a bit of energy for the end of the day. Okay, so hello everybody. It is lovely, lovely, lovely to be back here again. I was here last year. It's very nice of everybody to invite me back. I want to say thank you so much to the people at Game Happens organising this. They've done a fantastic job. It's lovely to be here at the end of the weekend. Thank you everybody. You've done awesome things. Thank you all. So this is a really, really lovely event. I want to thank all of you for coming. You've been supporting European culture, Italian games culture, and Genoese games development culture. I think that's a really cool thing to do. So keep supporting your local communities. Keep supporting the European community. I think it's a really important thing to do. I say that as a person who has got a home country that's trying to leave. Anyway, let's not talk about that bit. I'm Mata Haggis. Hello, if you don't know me. You can tweet about this talk. I'm at Mata Haggis. It will be on the top of slides in the future bit. I'm a video game and narrative designer. I've been working in AAA and indie games for over 15 years now. And I work at NHTV University in the Netherlands, which is Breda, although I am from England originally, where I am a professor of creative and entertainment video games. I make things fun, I make things entertaining, that is the goal. I'm also the founder of Copperstone C, which is a small company that does game and narrative design consultancy and training to help people get better at doing this kind of stuff. It's always nice. And I do other stuff, so I'm the Writers Guild of Great Britain, one of the video game people there. I work in Creative Europe Media as an external expert for them. I was the lead writer on The Dancer Awakens, which was a transmedia augmented reality storytelling thing which was submitted to a film festival. And as mentioned before, I'm most known for Fragments of Him, which is coming out on PlayStation 4 this year finally. Woohoo! So we're very happy about that. I also talk quite fast and there's a lot to say. So all of the main points are going to be on the slide behind me here. So if you want to read along with me, that makes life a lot easier because English accent, talking fast. Most people don't speak English as the native language, so I apologize about that bit in advance. But hopefully you'll be able to keep up with it over here. So interface and interaction design. Your game has two types of content. This is a huge generalization coming up here. But basically you've got your interactive stuff, like the big red bit that you squish on, and then you've got your non-interactive stuff, which is like the silver mounting, for example, that goes around it. And that's pretty much how games work. So for your players, a huge part of the cognitive load, a huge part of what they're trying to work out is telling the difference between these two things. So for players, that's almost never the fun part. That's the bit that doesn't excite them, trying to tell the difference. Now, performing the interactions, playing with it, that's the fun part for them. So you might want your games to be as intuitive as that button is. People look at that button, they understand it. Smash, I get that. You might want your game to be that intuitive. Maybe, maybe not. Or as intuitive as a hammer is. It's an object that we look at and we understand the nature of a hammer very, very quickly. So perhaps that's our goal as developers. But hammers are a lot more complicated than they may seem, and interface and interaction design is a huge topic. So to start off, before we go really deep into this, I want to talk to you about some basic principles that I use to help me talk about interface and interaction design. So your player needs to know three things to be able to engage with your content. First thing is a clear short or long-term goal, strategy or activity, which you could summarize as, what do I do? That's what the player asks when people go for these kind of things. What do I do in the game? The next thing is they need to know a clear way to attempt to achieve that goal. Signposting of affordances, things that are available to do in the world. We're going to be talking about affordances a lot today. And that's also kind of represented by the question, how do I do it? And finally, clear feedback on the success or failure of achieving that goal. Like, am I doing it right? And if you hit all... So I'm back slightly. If you hit all three of these, you tend to have a game which is fun, or compelling, or scary, or loving. These three things are basically what people need to be able to interact. By the way, these are going to be on the final summary slide of the thing, so if you're a person who likes taking photos and stuff, you can come back to that later. Successful games experiences always give this information to their player, either obviously or very subtly. And usually the difference between a really easy game and a really hard game is just how obvious the signposting is. It's always there, though, in good games. So if your game feels bad, it's probably due to one of these things being missing, and you can use these as a debug of your design. Ask those 3 questions and see if the answers are actually there in the content. So let's have some examples of these. In Journey, well, what's my goal? What am I trying to do? Well, my goal is to get to that big shiny mountain. Now, we all know mountains are things to go to. Not only is it a mountain, it's a shiny one. And shiny means good in video games. We all know this. Shiny means things I must collect. So how do I go about achieving that goal? Well, there's terrain and I have legs, so it's kind of moving is signposted. So I have to keep on moving around to get to that mountain. That's a very intuitive kind of goal. Am I succeeding or failing at achieving that goal? Well, that's fairly simple. Feedback is given through the mountain, slowly getting closer or being further away if you're not facing it. So it's very obvious about whether you're going towards the mountain or not. Really easy to play game. This is one of those approachable games. Dark Souls, not considered such an approachable game, generally. So what is my goal? Well, I've got a sword and I've got some legs. So I'm probably my strategy, in a short term at least, should be to walk around and kill some stuff. How do I go about achieving that goal of finding things? Well, there's paths to lead me through the world, so I should probably walk along the paths. That's very clearly signposted. And the very punishing difficulty tells me that I need to really pay close attention to what the enemies do. So it's kind of signposted that I have to pay attention, otherwise I will die a lot. Am I succeeding or failing at achieving that goal? Well, I get feedback on this when I find a new area or find a new weapon. New stuff is given to me when I progress. I sometimes get a cutscene, which really shows me when I'm progressing. And of course, I die very often, which tells me when I'm doing it wrong. So it's very clear, even though these are totally different games, they are actually working with these same kind of principles of how to get your player involved. So signposting, otherwise known as the communication of affordances. Affordance is a perceived or possible action implied by an object or a situation. It's a kind of how people read things. So whenever it's used in games, they make interactions as intuitive as a hammer is. These 3 principles that I mentioned just earlier, they are deceptively complicated to do. I started writing a little essay about them, which then became a short guide about them, and now I'm writing a book about them. It's one of those sort of subjects which keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're like, oh, damn it, that's going to be 100,000 words. So we really need to understand how signposting works to understand how these things go. So let's have a look at why hammers are such intuitive things. What is a hammer? This is a hammer. There you go. That's a hammer. We look at that and you go, yep, that's a hammer. I know it's a drawing of a hammer, but it's an adequate enough drawing of a hammer. So when we look at it, we immediately comprehend quite a few things about this. We have a kind of a purpose in mind when we see it. We understand what it's for. We can look at the kind of usefulness, the function of it. We get from the function, just the shape, the form follows function. Then we do this through kind of the visual and other sensory clues, which are conveying the purpose and function. There's the readability to it that helps us understand this kind of visual language there. And there's cultural experiences which we possess that remind us of previous hammers that we've seen. We've probably seen hammers before, and if we come from a culture where this is a typical hammer, we would understand that that's probably supposed to be a metal bit, even though I've just shaded it grey. We understand that this is a hammer. We get the kind of materials there. The aesthetics of it fit our experiences. So we have to make sure that readability is not inhibited by the aesthetics. Sometimes artists in games are very nice at making beautiful Baroque things, and I kind of go, is that a door? I don't know anymore. It's a very pretty thing. I don't know what it does. So be careful to stop your aesthetics blocking the readability. So what makes something read as a hammer? What makes something work like that? So yes, this is a hammer. I'm going to avoid the Duchampian kind of semiotics of all of this. This is not a hammer yet. Let's not even go down that path. I try to avoid semiotics. I've spent 20 years trying to avoid semiotics. I don't want to break that habit if I can possibly avoid it. It's a whole well of death and destruction. It's brilliant, but useful and terrible. We know it's a hammer because it's got a handle and it's got a hammerhead. These are things that tell us this is a hammer. These are components of a hammer that we could see here. It's shaped like a hammer, therefore it is a hammer. Cool, shape is important here. So let's compare it to some things that are not hammers to get a bit of additional insight. Well, that's a hammerhead. That's a stick. That's a pointy thing, maybe ice pick or something, I don't know. That's got a hammerhead and it's got a handle, but it's clearly not right. You're not going to try and hammer something with that, so there's something else going on there. This is not a hammer. It's got a hammerhead thing and it's got a stick, but the hammerhead isn't the right shape to be used. This, it could work, but it's going to be really tricky. And so there's kind of a ratio going on in here in terms of how this works, in terms of functionality. This is a hammer made of butter. So there's clearly something going wrong there. We wouldn't expect to try to use that as a hammer. And this is a ham sandwich, which is clearly not a hammer by many obvious reasons. So this hammer versus non-hammers thing starts us getting a deeper insight into what hammers are. Each of these objects has a hammeriness about it, but clearly is not a hammer, except for the ham sandwich, which doesn't have any hammeriness. It's not just a hammerhead plus any handle. It's quite specific about how that relationship of size, scale, ratio, how all these things blend together to create a hammer. And the material is very important too. We see it needs to be something fairly hard at the length of a thing which is just about hand length to get to be a hammer in our heads. So is hammeriness only dependent on shape and material? Well, that's two really good starting points. Well, this is the right shape and material, but it's clearly the wrong scale. This is a sculpture of a hammer. It's huge, and you kind of go, that's not a hammer anymore. It's a sculpture primarily that is shaped like a hammer, made with hammer stuff, but nobody will be able to use it. This is a toy hammer. There is no way that is a useful hammer unless perhaps you're breaking a piece of chocolate up or something, I suppose. Which, if you ever have it in the fridge, is really necessary. But I digress. So we can see that an incorrect scale, the size of it can mean that the shape and material can be correct, but the object could still not be a hammer in a very meaningful sense. Those are hammers, but not in a meaningful way that we would use a hammer. So if it's the right shape, the right material, and the right scale, it's a hammer, isn't it? Okay, yeah, maybe. I mean, we think we've kind of gone and got a good limit here. So what is a hammer? Well, this is a hammer. This is clearly a hammer. It's a hammer hitting a nail. That's what hammers do. So it's performing as a hammer very functionally here. Hammers hit nails, good, hammer. This is a hammer hitting a hand. Is the purpose of a hammer to hit a hand? Well, yeah, we sort of go, maybe, yeah, it could be. I mean, it's doing something that hammers regularly do, but it's not really what we intend hammers for. We go, I really need to hit somebody's hand. Has anybody got a hammer around here? It's not really what we think of hammers for. This is hitting a zombie to destroy the brain, so you're safe. We all know this about zombies, hammers, good thing here. This is not really what a hammer is for. This is a weapon now. This has stepped away from being a hammery thing. We're using it in a hammery way, but it's not really a hammer. This is a hammer holding down a load of papers so they don't blow away in the wind. This is a paperweight. This is not really functioning as a hammer. It is clearly a paperweight. It's a paperweight that happens to be shaped as a hammer. Or if we use it as a doorstop, stop the thing blowing shut. We know that is still, technically it's a hammer, but really in all meaning and purposefulness, it's a doorstop today. So is that still a hammer? So we understand that is a hammer only a hammer when it's used on nails, or is it something else when it's a paperweight? If a hammer never struck anything and has only ever held open doors, is it a hammer at all, or is it a doorstop? There's something about context which makes it different. So the relationship of an object to its surroundings is really part of defining its totality. And so we could call this the spatial context, the thing that sort of goes on around it. So how important is this spatial context to hammers? I think it's pretty important. And in the right spatial context, are these other things hammers? Well, that's a mallet. Not really for hammering, but it kind of works. That would probably work if we needed it to be a hammer. Can a shoe be a hammer? Yeah. Who here has used a shoe as a hammer? Yeah, that's about 2/3 of the room has used a shoe as a hammer at one point. This is a rolling pin. Yeah, anybody used that? Yeah, a few people have used those as hammers as well, okay. This is a rock. Yeah, almost the entire room has used a rock as a hammer once. Do you go, oh, I need a hammer, I'm going to find a small lump of metal? You would find it if you didn't have a hammer around, so that has temporarily become a hammer. The spatial context was right, and the time was right. By the way, I love the fact that I think this is the only games conference I ever go to where there are no guns on screen for pretty much the entire series of the weekend. I think that's awesome. So I apologize for letting you down at the last minute here, but I would like to applaud everybody else for doing that. So awesome, keep up that kind of thing. So yeah, this is a contextual hammer. So given the right context, there are lots of other things that can also be hammers. So being a hammer is actually kind of an affordance of many objects. It's something within the right time, within the right space, seen the right way. Hammering things is something they can do. It is something they can become. So we defined affordances earlier. An affordance is a perceived possible action implied by an object or situation. This actually came from the field of kind of nature studies and people looking at the psychology of animals, trying to understand how animals understand their environment in an intuitive way. So a bird flying between trees understands the affordance of what a tree is, understands the affordance of air, understands the affordance of the feel of wind blowing on its wings. So an affordance was considered part of kind of natural psychology, and then people started applying it to humans. Why do humans see the world the way they do? And it's actually a very deep field and a fascinating field to go into. I really do encourage you to research affordances to become better at game design. So affordances are things that people intuitively understand as a capacity of an object, depending on shape, scale, material, and the context around it. Affordances are how players understand the possibilities in our games. Because this is when they see something in the game, they are trying to judge affordances constantly. And the way we signpost things in our games is the way that people tell what to interact with and what is non-interactive stuff. Like I said at the beginning, basically games boil down to non-interactive things and interactive things. And telling that difference is a huge part of what a player does at any moment. So this is a classic example of affordances in action. Now, we know that doors typically do not take 2 buttons to open them. So they put down a whole trail of lights and a couple of things next to a door. Now, we know things next to doors are probably related to doors because that spatial context tells us that kind of thing. They needed buttons. They needed buttons that you weren't going to push, you were just going to stand on or could leave other objects on them. So they went, let's make a button. No, let's make a button. Let's make a button. And these are the most buttony looking buttons you'll probably ever see in a video game. They could not look more like buttons at all if you tried. Now, one of the things I really love about this, not only are they a big red button, which obviously is the thing you want to push anyway, you see that little yellow gap? That little yellow gap underneath it? That's the thing that says this can be pushed. That space there says push me, I move. And just that little inclusion of that space there makes it more than just a decorative button. This is a thing with serious potential to be stood on, weighted down, pushed. I love that. I think the affordance design in this game is absolutely superb. If you want to learn about puzzle design, signposting, like the little scorch marks around the world, and you kind of start going, what the hell am I supposed to do in this thing? Okay, there's a scorch mark there, so clearly I have to get a little plasma ball bouncing off of that. The scorch mark kind of affords bouncing is good in this area. And so there's so much signposting built into this game. It's a masterpiece of that kind of stuff. I really do encourage you to study this as a piece of interface design. So these kind of contextual hammers. Each of the objects here can temporarily become a hammer. So the context is not only spatial, but it can be temporal, as in related to time. In games, we're often quite bad about this. Something is usually permanently given a role, and it doesn't temporarily become anything else. And you can understand why, because we're trained not to think that way. So you've got to find a locked door, and you have a rocket launcher. Now, technically, temporarily, that rocket launcher could become a key. It would be a very permanent key, admittedly, but it could become a key, but it very rarely does. And I think this lack of kind of temporal affordance is something which is both a huge challenge and just in terms of systems design. What if there were no keys in your game and only rocket launchers? How do you design a game where that functions? Do you then suddenly start hiding rockets in boxes for people to use on keys as keys on doors? I thoroughly encourage you to make that game, please. I'd like to play it. But it's interesting to see how different temporal affordances could be changing things in games. So after we've hammered something with our shoe, the temporal context has passed, and we no longer intuitively think of it as a hammer. We don't think of ourselves as wearing hammers every day. Even though 2/3 of you in this room have used a shoe as a hammer, you don't think of them as hammers anymore. So are you wearing hammers right now? Sort of. At the right time, in the right place, in the right space? Yes, you are. Just not right now, because you don't need it. So there's always this question of, like, is rapid intuition the answer to good design? And this is Photoshop. This is not an incredibly intuitive interface, but it is very well designed. So it doesn't have to be that the answer is quick. It just has to be the answer is possible to explore and get to. So, and I think that's how Dark Souls works, that it isn't a fast intuition, but with enough play with that system, you begin to learn it. And I think that's the same way that a lot of people get through Photoshop. They learn through play with a complex system. So it is quite unintuitive to begin with, but it's also good for its target audience. The target audience expects it to be difficult. You don't go to Photoshop and go, my God, this thing's so powerful, I will use it instantly. You understand there's an investment of time required to get something good out of it. So it's kind of hardcore photo manipulators. As we get hardcore players, hardcore photo manipulators use Photoshop. Non-hardcore casuals use Instagram. I don't know, is that how it works? But this is the thing, it's funny when we put it into other contexts to think of players, or to think of users of photo manipulation software in terms of casual and hardcore. But we think of it perfectly normally in video games. And I think that signposts we're bad at affordances. I think that signposts we're bad at making our games playable to a lot of people. Because you don't expect people who use Photoshop to never use Instagram. That would be weird. But people who are hardcore EVE Online, Dark Souls players might not be sort of playing Candy Crush nearly as much. I think it's very weird that we have that sort of boundary within our culture. And I think that's something we should try to look at dissolving. So by understanding how fast, sorry, missing a space in there, how fast or how slowly the audience is willing to understand your interface, you can design more intelligently. So how quickly will you see a hammer in a shoe? Well, if we look at the number of days per year that a hammer is needed for you and compared to a builder, well, for you, maybe 3 days a year you need a hammer. I haven't actually needed one really, I don't think much in the last whole year, but you know, I'm being generous. For a builder, 150 days more, probably, I'm not sure. And so the way that we see the world is going to be quite different. So the way we see these affordances, I mean, recategorization of objects is not an intuitive process. Seeing a shoe as a hammer is a step that is required. So in this example, shoes as hammers. For more on this kind of idea of recategorization being really difficult, I encourage you to look at the work of Daniel Kahneman. He had this lovely diagram of System 1 and System 2 thinking, and he did a good book about this kind of stuff, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. You can buy it at airports. It's that good an introduction to psychology that it's just, everybody should read this book. It is so damn good. And he has this kind of idea that intuition is a thought process, and if you go across to System 2, you can make smarter choices. And eventually, if you keep on working in more complex ways, those move across to being intuitive processes again. So this is what we kind of call onboarding in video games. We make people do hard stuff before we then sort of move that across into easy stuff. Then we introduce some more hard stuff and move it across into easy. So this system of thinking, this system of understanding is absolutely core to game design. And this comes from a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. He's awesome. Please, please look up his work. So life experiences are a factor here. So a game dev and a builder has a different relationship with hammers and hammering. We are different from people who do this on a very, very regular basis. Both can equally perceive shoes as potential hammers. Of course, we're all intellectually capable of doing that. But the ease and willingness to conceive of shoes as hammers is not equal. It might be that we don't like improvising with the wrong tools. It might be that a builder has needed to use a shoe a lot of times. or maybe they have hammers around so often they don't ever want to use a shoe. There is a difference in our lived experiences which changes the way we see those affordances. So those life experiences will make the affordance of hammeriness be reached with greater or lesser ease. So different players will see the world in different ways. And this is something that we, as game designers, don't think of often enough. How different people will see our game, the cultural context, the social context, the background we come from is something that we miss a lot. So different people read your game world differently. For some, perceiving affordance will be intuitive, but for others, this may require a deliberate or purposeful act of comprehension. It's a huge thing for us to learn. This is why game devs should never test their own games. You are your worst tester, because the affordances all come from your own life. You see everything in your game as obvious. It's only when you give it to somebody else that you kind of go, well, don't you see the blue key on the blue door? And kind of go, I just thought that was a nice color key fob. You know, if people have never done blue key, blue door before, this is a new thing. And the further we go down those paths, the more and more complicated, the more and more game knowledge we're acquiring from players to engage with us. So subjective lived experiences change the nature of how people understand the world around them, including our games, and of course, including hammers. This is something that I really encourage you to remember when you do these things. So what is a hammer in the end? Well, I'm just going to avoid that. A hammer. Is this a hammer? Well, it's got the right material, it's got the right shape and scale, it can conceive it and perceive it as that. It's in a spatial context, and there's a thing that needs to be hammered. So I think, for the moment, that shoe is definitely a hammer. Because we've got all the factors in there which say that is now a hammer. And perhaps if I'd asked you that question 25 minutes ago, you'd gone, no, it's a shoe. So you now have a context of a half-hour talk about seeing shoes as hammers. And so perhaps now your affordance in the world has changed. Interesting. So when we signpost these things, in digital media, we use visual, audio, and haptic. These are our three systems. Haptic is like feelable stuff, vibration, wind blowing in your face, these kind of things. So to help players understand the digital world, we can use shape, material. These will be on the last slide again, by the way. Scale, spatial context, temporal context, and conceivable and perceptual cultural language that will resonate with the lived experiences of our users. These are the main things that we will be getting people to use to understand how our game works. And a lot of this we'll do intuitively, but I think it's really useful to have it in this kind of list. I'll show those again at the end of the talk. So a hammer is not only an object, instead it is a collection of signs that intuitively or purposefully transformed by users into meanings and actions, which unfortunately means I now need to slap myself in the face. For 20 years ago, the me is going, no semiotics, and I've ended up with semiotics anyway. I'm so sorry. It's a collection of signs. I'm sad at myself for this, I really am. But sometimes semiotics are necessary. So I want to give you an in-game example. I could have used a button for this because that's easy, but frankly, it's boring. So let's not do that. Let's do a more obvious in-game example. Let's use a path. So the goal is to get players to walk along the path. This is our path area. We don't want them to walk up to the top of the hill. We want them to walk along the sides of the hill. Now, players like walking to the top of hills. So if we just made our game world look like that without the arrows, look like that, there would be a problem here. So we need to work out ways to do this. So we could use shape and material. That is a path shape. It is a path kind of material. It's different from the grass. It could be dirt, it could be tarmac, it could be anything. It's a different material. We see that's more pathy. We can change the scale. If we make it wider, it looks like more people use it. And so that's a more recognizable road path area. Scale has changed how easily we read that as a path. We can change the spatial context. Let's adapt the things around it to make it look like people don't walk off this very often. Make it look more path-like. Maybe put a bit of shadow on top of the hill to make it look less interesting than walking along this brightly lit path in the middle there. The spatial context makes it look more appealing and path-like. We could have it happening at sunset. So the temporal context is, it's going to get dark soon and you won't be able to see where you're going. You need to hurry along to a location. And we know locations are led to by paths. Roads lead to places. So we now have a temporal context to make that path look more appealing. And of course, we have to check with the audience. We have to check whether it matches your idea of a path. Does this look like a path to you now? Yeah? Nodding? Mostly nodding? Anybody, this doesn't look like a path? If so, I've done it wrong. I see more nods. This is good. Then we have successfully done this. We've applied all these factors of affordances to make the game world easier to read, and the player is more likely to perform the action that we want them to. Not by forcing them to, not by penalizing them, but just by defining the affordance of a path better. So in conclusion, when interface and interaction design goes wrong, which is where the player gets lost, they get confused, or even where they get misled, it's hard to fix without a deeper understanding of how signposting works. Signposting is this kind of really important thing to help people keep on that right path, to stop them getting lost. So I hope today's talk has given you some angles of analysis to help you understand how players read your worlds, how they get to those perceptions. So when people get lost, I think these are things you can look through to see how it works. I love trying to bring intuitive design into conscious practice, because a lot of you will be doing this stuff automatically already, because it is intuitive, because a hammer is intuitive, and you will be doing this stuff intuitively. But now when it goes wrong, hopefully you can go, oh, is it done that? Is it done that? Is it, ah. Or the context, oh yeah, I gave them that thing over there, which is a completely different context, and they never thought about it in this context. So there's lots of things we can use to debug once we're conscious of the steps. And because I think it's how we evolve as creators, becoming more intelligent, becoming more systematic, understanding what's intuitive inside us, helps us move across from that system to difficult, effortful thing to making these things even more intuitive for ourselves. It helps us evolve and be better at what we do. So I hope today's talk is going to help you make even better design choices in the future. So once again, I want to say thank you very much to Game Happens, and thank you all so much for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.